Great. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Ayumi Teraoka. I'm a postdoc fellow at Weatherhead East Asian Institute, and also represent East Asian Institute's Japan Research Program, directed by Professor Jerry Curtis, who's in Japan today. Before we start, I want to note that this event was advertised as starting from 4 to 6, but we would like to end the event a little early at 5:30. But Professor Mori is happy to stay in the room until 6 to hang out with you, and there are cookies and coffee, so please stay if you have additional questions. Let me introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Satoru Mori is Professor of Contemporary International Politics at Keio University and Deputy Director of Keio Center for Strategy. Professor Mori is an expert on U.S. Strategy in Asia, defense innovations, and also U.S. defense strategy during Cold War. His first book is about Vietnam War and alliance diplomacy. Professor Mori holds a number of degrees, including PhD from University of Tokyo, law degrees from Columbia Law School, and also has a bachelor degree from Kyoto University and law degree from Kyoto University. He's also a former career diplomat, which makes him a really unique academic in Japan, who knows the practitioner side of policymaking and also strategic side of history and international relations. Before joining Keio, he was a professor at Hosei University, and during sabbatical leave, he also was a visiting researcher at Princeton and also George Washington University. I should emphasize that we are very lucky to have him. I cannot think of a better person who actually knows this topic today, Japan's strategy in Indo-Pacific. And he is one of the handful of scholars in Tokyo who are really plugged into the decision-making process of the government, and he gets often consulted by Japanese administrations on defense strategy papers. So Professor Mori, floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I would first like to thank the Weatherhead Center as well as the China of the World program for hosting me. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak here today, and special thanks to Teraoka-san for moderating this session. What I would like to do is talk about Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific. I titled my presentation, can I put up over here? Okay. Yes. So I titled it, the title of my talk is Japan's Strategy in the Indo-Pacific, but I would like to address three questions here. First, how does Japan see its own security environment? And second, what role does Japan intend to play in the Indo-Pacific region? And thirdly, how is Japan reacting to the shifting strategic landscape in the region? So some of the stuff that I will mention today might be familiar to some of you, but please bear with me. Now, I want to start off by making the point that if you look at the three strategic document that was issued in December 2022, you will see that Japan increasingly sees its security environment through a geostrategic prism, meaning that its focus is basically on China, North Korea, and Russia. Now, this has been a continuing trend, but I think it has become more conspicuous over the past several years. And also, there is a near consensus in Japan that its security environment has been worsening over the last decade. And one of the sort of punchlines in the national security strategy of Japan in 2022 identifies China as Japan's primary security challenge quite conspicuously, and it stands out. China is characterized as probably the biggest and the most formidable challenger to the existing international order. But I should also note that China is not characterized as a threat, not as a threat. What does this mean? It means that, having engaged in discussions with senior government officials, there is this recognition that Japan needs to maintain dialogue, even in the midst of a very severe security relationship with China. It means that there is this realization that, particularly with a regime like China, where the leader has a strong, enormous power over foreign policy and defense policy decision making, it is particularly important to maintain heads of state diplomacy between Japan and China. But nevertheless, there has been a lot of concern over the so-called Taiwan situation. I will come back to this later on. So China actually is characterized as the #1 security challenge. North Korea and Russia are also mentioned in the documents, but compared to China, they are in the second tier, I would say. North Korea's nuclear development is obviously, and missile development is obviously still a strong concern of the Japanese government. And Russia is engaging in more how should I say collaborative military activities with China around Japan, and that has caused an increase in concern. And more recently, I would say that Russia is becoming a different sort of security challenge because these two countries are now increasingly cooperating. As you know, Russia has been requesting North Korea to provide military material. And we worry what kind of military technology could be potentially transferred from Russia to North Korea. Some people worry about military satellite technology, perhaps even submarine technology could be provided by Russia to North Korea. So this is a sort of a changing strategic landscape in Northeast Asia. Another question that is now arising is the worry over the sustainability of U.S. regional engagement. And this is basically about what is going to happen to Japanese security if Mr. Trump comes back to the White House. And, expert communities begin to debate about the consequences of, what could Mr. Trump's second term, America First, be translated into what kind of policy towards the Indo-Pacific. And that's a new sort of a concern that is emerging right now in Japan. Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific. Japan's style of foreign engagement has changed over the last decade, I would say. I wrote this phrase from a passive order taker to an active order builder. What do I mean by that? Some of you may have heard this Japanese vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This vision was advanced primarily by Prime Minister Abe, because I think it was a way to sort of indicate a vision of what the world would ideally look like. And this is basically about building a rules-based order, free and open rules-based order. This was during a time of flux, I would say. People were looking at China's rise, and people were wondering which direction China would go. And so particularly the Japanese government was trying to define some of the approaches that could potentially generate this sort of rules-based order, even in the midst of increasing security competition and China's rise and so forth. So in that process, Japan came up with multiple approaches using not only defense, but also diplomacy and also other economic means to shape the trajectory of the Indo-Pacific region. And as a result, I think the Japanese government has now become more of a sort of a proactive player in the region. And I should also note that if you look at some of the interviews that Prime Minister Abe gave after he stepped down from the Prime Minister, he did mention that one of the main considerations upon forging this concept of free and open Indo-Pacific was the idea of advancing liberal values in the region. And so he did very much attach importance to the rule of law, democracy, and human rights upon considering this sort of vision in the Indo-Pacific. Moving on, so I would say that, what type of role does Japan want to play in the Indo-Pacific? I would identify four, perhaps, roles. One is the rule promoting power that seeks international relations to be governed by rules, not power. I think this is fundamental, and it continues to this day. And second would be deterring power that opposes unilateral change of the status quo by force. Force meaning not only military power, but through less non-military means as well. And thirdly, stabilizing force that seeks regional inclusivity rather than division. I think this is a sort of a persistent theme in Japanese diplomacy. It does realize that there is increasing great power competition in the region, but Japan wants to maintain a sort of an inclusive approach, not divide the region, but try to maintain inclusivity. And the fourth one would be a sort of a regional connector that advances trade liberalization while pursuing economic security. And so these are some roles that Japan is trying to play. And some of the initiatives that I will be explaining later on would be sort of defined by this kind of a self-image of trying to advance rules-based order by playing and breaking it down to these four different roles. So let me start. I would like to talk about defense, diplomacy, and also economic security or economic engagement. So the three areas in a little bit more detail. First area is deterrence or defense. Japan, together with the United States, wants to deter unilateral change of the status quo by force. And when I say this, China is primarily is the main actor that we have in mind. As many of you may know, the Japanese government made a major decision toward the end of last year to double the defense budget by 2027. And right now, Japan's annual defense budget is roughly 33 billion in US dollars. And they're going to increase it, if you double it, it's 66 billion. But the actual investment devoted to developing defense capability is only 53 billion. And so there's a gap of 13 billion, which will be spent on 4 other security-related areas. I'll get into more details later on. 4 other security-related areas, what I mean by that, one is defense research and development. Second is what they call the active cyber defense. And third one is investing in public infrastructure, preparing for contingencies. And the fourth one is what they call the official security assistance. And official security assistance is a new development. Traditionally, Japan's ODA or official development assistance was, there was a governing principle that it must be non-military in nature. But now they have made a major shift, a policy change, saying that the Japanese government is now able to provide equipment and also infrastructure investment to foreign militaries. So this is a major change that is now happening. There are 3 main lines of effort when you talk about both increasing Japan's defense capabilities. One is to sort of actually invest in concrete defense capabilities, and they have identified 7 capability areas. For example, number 1 is standoff capabilities, which refers to long-range precision strike capabilities. Second is integrated air missile defense capabilities. And the third one is unmanned systems. Fourth one is command and control and intelligence. And the fifth one is cross-domain operations. They refer to space, cyberspace, and electromagnetic domain capabilities. And sixth one is strategic mobility, transport capabilities. And the last one is resilience and sustainability. And so those are 7 areas where they are trying to invest. What does this all mean for the alliance? What does Japan investing its defense capability mean in the context of roles and capabilities between roles, missions, and capabilities between Japan and the United States? Having discussed this issue with senior government officials, my understanding is that right now there is this so-called American spear and Japanese shield in the context of defense of Japan. This has been the traditional notion of division of labor. So this is a functional division of labor. The Japanese government or Japan assuming the role of defense, and the U.S. forces playing the role of offensive operations. But now, by pursuing these capabilities, Japan is going to assume a larger portion of this offensive role. And as a result of that, the United States will now be able to focus more on defense of Taiwan. So what's happening is there is a shift from a functional division of labor to a theater division of labor. And that is the ultimate goal of this defense capability buildup, defense buildup effort. So this is one point that I wanted to make. Second one is more technical, reinforcing defense cooperation with the United States. There are several lines of efforts, but I mentioned force posture, concept of operations, and command and control. And the more recent urgent issue is command and control. And Japan is going to establish what they call the permanent joint headquarters, which is going to combine the 3 services under a unified headquarters to enhance joint operations capability of the Japan Self-Defense Force. And also, the United States is also the Congress, through its National Defense Authorization Act, mandated Indo-Pacific to establish what they call the Joint Forces Headquarters, which will be the counterpart to this new PJHQ, Permanent Joint Headquarters. And they are now discussing about the future shape and form of this new US headquarters. And the idea is, what is the ideal or optimal way of, what they call the parallel command between Japan and the United States. Third line of efforts is to enhance security cooperation with third countries. We have concluded what we call the reciprocal access agreement with Australia. Some of you may have seen the Camp David meeting, which launched a number of initiatives, including cooperation to deter North Korea, like joint training, what they call multi-domain joint training, and also sharing of ballistic missile data between South Korea, US, and Japan, and also dealing with North Korean cyber activities and so forth. Quad is another area where they are advancing security cooperation, particularly in the maritime domain area. They've initiated what they call the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative to share sensor data among the regional countries. And GCAP is Japan's next generation fighter program that Japan is advancing with UK and Italy. And lastly, there is this debate about whether Japan should join what they call the AUKUS, UK, US, Australia Defense Technology Cooperation Initiative. Pillar 1 is devoted to provision of nuclear submarine technology to Australia, but they have what they call the Pillar 2, which deals with various kinds of advanced technologies for defense application. And there is a debate about whether Japan should, a la carte participate in some of the Pillar 2 activities. Personally, I believe Japan should join this AUKUS framework. But if you're interested, I'll be happy to talk about this during Q&A. And lastly, Taiwan contingency has received considerable attention over the past year and a half, I would say. Initially, there were worries about, Taiwan, the possibility of China engaging in a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. And later on, people were more focused on the so-called blockade scenario. But I think they've come full circle, and they are now much more worried about this sort of full-scale invasion scenario right now over Taiwan. I would say that the general understanding among the expert community, particularly focused on the regional study side, regional experts, is that it is not going to happen anytime soon because the risks are too high, and China does not have the necessary capabilities yet. And if Xi Jinping, Mr. Xi, starts this invasion and he fails, it's going to undermine his CCP legitimacy, and it would be a huge risk. And so that's the general understanding. But on the defense security expert community, they say that the timing is not really possible to predict. And what is important is to build up the necessary deterrent capabilities in order to not let it happen. And so, although this timeline issue I don't think is really productive, it's probably necessary to think about not allowing the Chinese leadership to think that they can achieve their political objective by using force in any type of scenario. So I'd be happy to go deeper in this issue later on, but that's the state of the debate right now. Diplomacy, free and open rules-based international order. I mentioned this, and Japan's pursuing this through various vehicles. Japan-US relations is obviously at the core, and the G7. I'll get to the Hiroshima G7 summit was a highlight of this year for Kishida government. And that's been a major platform from which Japan is trying to deploy a very wide-ranging diplomacy in various directions, and also other US allies. Japan's also increasing its cooperation with NATO right now. The Prime Minister annually visits the NATO heads of state meeting these days. So those are some sort of like-minded countries that share common values. And there are other countries in Southeast Asia and beyond, where Japan is trying to engage. And G20 and Prime Minister Kishida participated in the G20 summit, and he also participated in the East Asia summit. And those are two very important diplomatic platforms. And I'll come back to this later on also, but there's increasing debate about how Japan should engage the so-called global South countries. And there's a debate about whether that term is appropriate or not, because it's referring to a very diverse set of countries with different political systems. But Japan nevertheless has a history of engaging these countries through economic and diplomatic means. And so, but what is the goal? What should be the goal of engaging these countries and so forth? Is a debate right now in Japan. Hiroshima G7 summit. Very briefly, the two main goals that the Japanese Sherpa mentioned in one of his interview was that there were basically two main goals. One was to declare the resolve to uphold a free and open rules-based international order. And you may have seen President Zelensky join the summit meeting. And this was a place where the G7 countries wanted to send a message to countries like Russia and potentially China that this kind of use of force to change the territorial status quo is not acceptable. And secondly, also Japan invited countries like India and others to the meeting. And this outreach effort to go beyond the G7 was a major initiative that was launched by Japan during the Hiroshima G7 summit. And the idea was to show that you need a wide range of partners to solve transnational issues like climate change and other energy security and food security and so forth. So I think it was a big success. I think it generally received a good assessment from the press of the various countries. But if you look at the global South countries, the media reporting, they didn't really pay much attention because they really didn't care about the G7 countries. So there's a big hallmark. How do you communicate and build trust with countries beyond G7 is a new sort of a policy issue right now. I'm not going through the issues right now because I'm going to run out of time, but I want to go to the next slide about this free and open Indo-Pacific. Some of you who are familiar with this free and open Indo-Pacific concept, I'm not going to bore you with the history of the concept because there's a standard narrative and explanation of how Prime Minister Abe advanced this concept. Originally, it was a sort of a development assistance oriented concept, but it kind of underwent a rebirth, and it is a way through which Japan communicates its vision for the regional order. And some of the basic principles are like defend freedom and the rule of law and respect the diversity, inclusiveness, and openness. And they renewed this vision. The Foreign Ministry has a devoted home web page for this initiative. And if you look at it, it used to be 3 pillars, but they've expanded it to 4 pillars. And now they have 4 lines of effort to sort of pursue this vision. First one is a sort of a goal, stating the goal, upholding fundamental principles for peace and rules for prosperity. Second is addressing transnational issues. And third is promoting connectivity. And fourth is security and safety of the sea and the air. And there are many, many individual specific initiatives that are listed in the Foreign Ministry homepage. So any of you who are interested, please look at the homepage. But it's not something very abstract, but there are ongoing concrete programs already progressing as we speak. I did mention global South countries and Japan's relationship with, I also want to touch upon Japan's relationship with South Korea. And it has dramatically improved, and it culminated in the Camp David meeting in August 2023. This was a huge breakthrough. I think President Yoon receives great credit for this dramatic change. Japan is also happy about sort of overcoming this historical issue to some extent. I don't think it's going to go away forever, but nevertheless, I think we are now in a net new phase where Japan, South Korea, and US is able to cooperate on many issues. If you look at the list of initiatives that they actually decided to launch, it's quite impressive. And there are a certain number of Indo-Pacific cooperative activities agreed by the 3 leaders. One of them is coordination of humanitarian and development policies in the Indo-Pacific region. Second one was development finance. And the third one was maritime security capacity building programs. So those are some major initiatives that the 3 countries will jointly pursue in the region. Hopefully will lead to fruitful outcomes in some of the regional countries' capacity building in various areas. Lastly, economic engagement. Japan seeks to promote free and fair trade in the Indo-Pacific region. Japan has been repeatedly saying that U.S. should come back to CPTPP, but we actually understand that that's not politically possible right now. So we feel rather lonely, but nevertheless, CPTPP is supposed to be the central pillar in the economic domain for Indo-Pacific, but neither the United States or India is in CPTPP. And I hope there were more countries, and UK actually acceded to the CPTPP. I think they signed the document this July. I think it needs to continue advancing trade liberalization, even in the midst of this sort of economic securitization of trade and foreign economic relations. And but also Japan is also trying to sort of address trade distorting policies by foreign countries through international trade bodies such as WTO. But at the same time, there is this realization within the Japanese government that simply opening market to everyone is not the way to live right now, and that there are certain risks associated with foreign economic dependence. And that's why there is this increasing recognition or notion of economic security. The supply chain security term appears almost every day on Japanese newspapers. And Japan is also looking to sort of enhance economic relations with trusted partners, such as G7 and Quad countries, and cooperation with certain third countries. And the idea is to sort of build resilient supply chains based on basic principles like transparency and diversity and security and sustainability and credibility. And G7, I believe, established this new counter-economic coercion coordination platform. And they've come up with certain elements like early warning and prompt information sharing and deterrence and response. But personally, I am a little bit skeptical about the effectiveness of counter-economic coercion, because it's very, very difficult politically to come to the aid of another country that is being economically coerced by China, right? I mean, you have to have almost very, very high, how should I say, political trust and also coordination. And so we'll have to see how, even though they might come up with a certain mechanism, we'll have to see whether it's going to be actually implemented. I would imagine that it would be the main player would be the US helping other countries. It might be a little bit difficult for Japan, for example, to help a third country, not other than US, to counter economic coercion, but we'll see how things go. De-risking is a term, as you may know, that has emerged. De-risking, not decoupling, is the preferred phrase that they use. Why do they use this term? I think it, on the one hand, sends signals to China that states are not looking to block China's economic development. I think this is very important. It's not that so much as it's a containment of China. That's not the case. And all G7 countries realize that they have to maintain a certain degree, economic relationship and economic exchange with China, and that they don't intend to completely cut off economic relations with China. But at the same time, they see China's economic coercion and worry about, potentially being targeted by China on certain policy issues and so forth. So not only this factor, but they are ready to engage China and build constructive, stable relationship, but also try to sort of diversify the supply chain, not rely solely on a particular country like China on various supplies of products and so forth. So to wrap up, I would say, there are many sort of goals for Japan's strategy in the Indo-Pacific, but I would like to wrap up by pointing out three. First is to sort of convince China that changing the status quo by unilateral action or by force is not in China's favor. I think this is the main message that Japan's trying to pitch. And so all the defense efforts and all the coalition building in the defense area is intended to send a signal to China that arms buildup and arms race will not produce results, because it would be met by multinational balancing act. And so that's one goal that Japan's pursuing under the deterrence line of effort. And secondly, I think Japan's trying to rediscover and forge a new economic space that would allow it to tap into new sources of growth in the age of supply chain reconfiguration and also manage risks. And I mentioned about Japan's relationship with the global South countries. And, many people talk about the necessity of doing a sort of a almost omnidirectional diplomacy, but simply, pursuing a nice relationship with third country is not so strategic. And personally, I think what's probably necessary to speak with Global South countries is to come up and identify mutually beneficial projects, not only development assistance project, but business opportunities and so forth. Identify areas of mutual economic opportunity. And particularly in an era where we are trying to de-risk and diversify our supply chain, I think we should look beyond our existing economic relationship, foreign economic relationship, and find new partners in various countries, ranging from Africa to Southeast Asia and even Latin America as well. And thirdly, actively coordinate with the United States to pursue deeper region-wide engagement. And I talked about this minilateral and multilateral frameworks that the Biden administration has been actively, invigorating. And I think that those frameworks or vehicles were forged partly for the purpose of competing with China. But I think if we were, I sort of revisiting what if Mr. Trump comes back, America First approach, I think those frameworks will function in reverse, meaning that US allies and partners will try to use those unilateral frameworks to get US to get engaged in various regions. And I think that's the kind of crafty, I'm not quite sure whether it'll work, but we'll have to use those vehicles to elicit US regional engagement. I think the original Abe-san's framework was also kind of driven by that kind of worry that US disengagement might surface, and therefore it's necessary to sort of come up with a narrative and also a framework to get the United States to continue engaging the region in the mid to long term. So lastly, I think there are other, it seems that Japan has been engaging in a lot of debate about foreign and defense policy. And many of the homeworks, particularly in the area of security, were sort of outlined in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy and the defense build-up plan. But there are fundamental questions like, are Japan and the United States really ready for a Taiwan contingency? I mean, people talk about the necessity of building up deterrent capability, but this is about 5 years, 10 years out when you have the capabilities. But I don't necessarily think that Taiwan contingencies is going to happen within 5 years or so, but we have to be thinking about everything beyond government policy, for example. I think the two governments are very firm in resisting Chinese aggression of Taiwan, but is the public opinion ready for this kind of eventuality, both on the Japanese side and also on the American side? Do people have, what kind of understanding do our people have about the meaning of defending Taiwan by risking our lives, and so forth? So that's a sort of a question that remains to be answered. And second, what economic and technological means can Japan leverage to strengthen engagement with third countries? I talked about the Global South diplomacy, but that's a very abstract terms, and we have to be more specific about depending on what countries we are engaging. And lastly, how might Japan's strategy in the Indo-Pacific be affected by the United States? This is not only about Mr. Trump, but also about the looming and developing crisis in the Middle East. How is that going to affect the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States? And how is that going to be perceived by China and North Korea? Do they see it as a sort of a diversion away from the Indo-Pacific to the Middle East and Europe and so forth? So those are some questions that I think we have to continue exploring. And I'll be happy to, discuss with Teraoka-san for a while and get questions from the floor. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will start our discussion section, but before I do, I will turn to Professor Christensen, who's a director of China and War Program, for if he has any comments or questions.
Thank you very much, Mori-san. It was a great comprehensive talk. I learned a lot. I wrote a lot of notes. And I was really pleased that you gave some of the history. I was in the government when then Prime Minister Abe in 2007 came up with the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific. Many Americans think it's an American concept. Many Americans think the Quad is an American concept. Again, it's a Japanese concept. And many Americans believe that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was originally an American idea, and it was not, as you know. So Japan has played a very constructive role on various strategic and economic initiatives in the region. And I applaud that. I guess my question is really about, is Japan ready for a changing U.S. military strategy in the region? There's a lot been written about this. I'm always obliged to say in these contexts that this is just my opinions, not the opinions of the U.S. State Department. But the question is the Japanese public prepared to accept a more diversified, mobile U.S. military presence in Japan? And does Japan believe that a country like the Philippines will be ready to participate in that? So that's my first question, because that's not just a Tokyo question. That's a question about local governments and their willingness to participate in a national plan. And my second question is about the military assistance program. What is the focus of it? I think of the South China Sea as a place where Japan can play a constructive role in building up the capacities of the various disputants. And I would like to hear your views on how Japan can best use what is still a limited amount of money. It's still a limited amount of money, but it's a new initiative. So it's exciting and different. But what's the best use for that funding in your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Christensen. Regarding your first question about whether Japan will be prepared to sort of accommodate U.S. forward deployed units, I think on the conventional side, we have been seeing some initiative that kind of minimizes friction with the local communities, like changing existing units that are already stationed to a new function. So one example is what they call the Marine Littoral Regiment. Yeah. And so they're now arming these units. It's been there, but they're changing the function and allowing these units to acquire so-called surface-to-ship anti-ship missile. And so I think rather than bringing in new missile forces to new locations, I think there are existing locations. And if you try to, equip these existing units with new functions, I think it would somehow sort of mitigate a local resistance or local backlash that could potentially be happen if you bring in a totally new missile unit. So people have been talking about will the United States deploy ballistic missile capable units into Japan? But I think that's probably a very sort of a contentious issue. And so there might be a certain threshold about over which Japan would have a hard time going over. But if it's like anti-ship missiles for existing units, I think so far we haven't seen that kind of a strong backlash. So so it depends on the kind of enhanced capabilities we're talking about. On the nuclear side, I don't think it's something similar to Korea is not going to happen. So I think primarily it would be about U.S. maintaining a sea-based deterrent. Capacity building for the official security assistance. I think some of the primary recipients of the assistance include countries like Philippines. And I think not only capacity building on the maritime domain area, but also I think military construction program would be my personal opinion would help because the United States forces is looking beyond Japan to sort of diversify its force posture. And so, and oftentimes we hear about the vulnerability of U.S. bases in the Western Pacific region. So I think hardening and expanding and investing in these military construction programs in the Western Pacific would be sort of a synergistic effort if it happens. And it's not only for the U.S. forces, but it's also for Japanese self-defensive forces can sort of access, do visiting, and do exercise and so forth. So in my personal opinion, infrastructure, a military construction investment would be sort of one way to make use of this official security assistance program. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I will also ask my own question. Yes. So, thank you so much. So one of the issues that are kind of popping up on the news media headlines are about central government in Tokyo's efforts to reach out to Kyushu prefectural government to accept some of the evacuees, potential evacuees from Sakishima Islands, which include Miyako and Ishigaki, those islands very, very close to Taiwan. I just wonder what your thoughts are about the politics over these new coordination between Kyushu and Okinawa Islands, if those initiatives will bear fruit, or if it's an efficient or effective way of thinking about preparing for contingency.
I think civilian evacuation operation from the southwestern islands to the Kyushu region, before getting into the actual local politics, I think there's a legal issue. What this is Japan has this very, how should I say, precise legal constructs to determine what is possible under certain, legal conditions and so forth. And in order for the central government to direct probably the governor or the local municipalities to actually issue an order for the civilians to evacuate, they require what is called the armed attack anticipatory situation. And if that order is issued, then they can actually deliver an official government-sanctioned evacuation order. But if you do that, it means you have to designate, or there needs to be a government finding that you're actually getting closer to a war, which means you have to identify China, probably and if that happens, that would dramatically, there is concern among certain politicians that act itself will dramatically increase the tension and possibly complicate this evacuation process. So that's a big problem that needs to be issued. If that is cleared, I wonder, there are probably about 120,000 people living in the southwestern islands. Is it really possible to evacuate them? And is it safe to evacuate them to Kyushu? Because we're talking about Taiwan contingents, right? So depending on at which stage you are going to implement that evacuation operation, it's going to, either become impossible. If it's very, very early on, and we have enough capacity, not only with government ships, but also commercial ships, taking risks to transport people from southwestern islands, I think the number is too large, and it would complicate the operation. And if the crisis actually, the level of crisis increases, then I think that operation itself becomes very, very increasingly difficult. So before coming to the question of whether Kyushu will be able to absorb them, receive these people, I think the hurdles are very, very high. And but at the end of the day, I think Diet members, as well as local parliamentarians, will probably have to work on this issue, because they have to assure the residents of the southwestern islands that they have a way out. But the question of whether that's viable or feasible is a completely different situation, both for legal circumstances and for practical circumstances. So that would be my answer.
I will ask my second questions, but feel free to start thinking about your own questions, and I will turn to you in the audience, and also people in the Zoom. I will also take your questions. So please type in your questions when you have one. Second question is, in Japan, the country that's pretty rapidly changing on security postures, and sort of traditional ways of pacifist nations almost appear to be gone in many respects. One of the remaining element of Japan's posture towards security that remains unchanged seems like is nuclear issues. There were some commentaries by former Prime Minister Abe about nuclear sharing, but that's also after he stepped out of the office. Now discussions on nuclear seems to not be in the central focus among the public discourse, but I wonder what your sense is over Japanese public response to nuclear questions and nuclear issues. I mean, you mentioned about South Korea, but if you could elaborate that, thank you.
Okay, yes, sure. Last summer, there was a lot of talk about the risks of nuclear coercion, because Mr. Putin was doing it in Ukraine. People, not only the experts, but also former government officials, former self-defense force officers, raised this question about what if China engaged in an early nuclear coercion against the United States and Japan. And at that time, people really were worried because that could have a very, very strong deterrent effect. And, if you think about the impact on the Japanese society, you could easily imagine a sort of a panic-like situation, stock markets falling down and so forth. But it wasn't not really clear what kind of counteraction could be possible. I mean, I think the United States, the only way to go, overcome this question would be for a counter statement by the United States saying that if China actually does attack Japan with nuclear weapons, that U.S. extended deterrence is still viable, and sort of negate or neutralize that kind of nuclear coercion. So that kind of reassurance by the United States is going to be critical. That was one of the emerging points that came out. Secondly, there was a more sort of an expert level discussion about China's growing nuclear arsenal. The Pentagon's China military power report forecasted that China is going to have 1,000 warheads by 2030, and maybe 1,500 warheads by 2035, I think. And people started wondering what the implications are for a potential Taiwan contingency. And the debate was saying, the argument was that there would be a sort of a so-called stability-instability paradox, meaning that China would be more confident to sort of counter U.S. military coercion in the event of a conflict. And if it were able to sort of, offset the nuclear level balance, then it would become increasingly more confident on the conventional level, where China has developed what they call the A280 capability, or theater offensive capabilities. And if that happens, it's actually going to generate instability, because China would feel that it can overwhelm US and Japanese forces at the outset or the onset of a conflict. Because US bases and Japanese bases in the Western Pacific are very vulnerable to conventional missile strikes and salvo attacks, and a very limited number of bases here. So as a result of that, the experts argued that US would have to rely more on US theater nuclear capability. And they were looking at Biden administration's nuclear policy, and they saw the Biden administration's decision to cancel the sea-launched cruise missile, nuclear tipped, what they call the Slicker Man program. And some experts said that this was sort of not reassuring. But I think the Biden administration's position is that this function is being carried out by a different nuclear warhead, I think it was 76-2 or something, low yield nuclear weapons on top of Trident D5 submarine-launched ballistic missiles on US nuclear submarines. And so there is a sort of a debate about whether there is sufficient or enough theater-rich US nuclear capability to offset or deter Chinese conventional superiority. And third point is, you mentioned about nuclear sharing. Japanese experts also debated about whether there could be a possible nuclear sharing, but I think there is near consensus that Japan cannot replicate NATO type nuclear sharing. Allowing forward deployed nuclear weapons and are carried out by Japanese aircraft is not going to be possible. So the hardware option is out. I don't think there's any much enthusiasm even for a sort of a consultative mechanism, something similar to also to NATO and other countries. So I think, there are obviously different opinions, but my sense is that the current general understanding is that status quo is quite sufficient to maintain nuclear deterrence vis-a-vis China and potentially also North Korea and so forth. So yeah, that would be my view. Yes. Yeah.
So I will open up perhaps one.
Hi, I'm a visiting fellow here at the Weatherhead Center from Vietnam. I noticed that in the 2000s up to the early 2010s, Japan had been investing a lot in the Mekong region, in Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, of course, but also Myanmar, Thailand. but in the wake of the Belt and Road initiative of China, it seems that China's been sort of getting the upper hand there, and many of the sort of initiatives of Japan in the sort of early days, like the sub-region, seem to have fallen off quite a bit. Has Japan, and you know, in your earlier statements, you also said that Japan's sort of focusing on, first of all, countries like India, Australia, you know, but also like sort of like-minded countries, which I guess is another word for sort of regional democracies, right? Has Japan more or less given up on places like Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, so on?
Okay, thank you. I don't think Japan has given up. I think it still is enthusiastic about advancing various kinds of cooperative programs with various regional countries. I'm not quite sure about the specific programs that are now running in Cambodia, Laos, and Cambodia and Laos. Vietnam is very, very important in terms of maritime security. So I think Japan's advancing capacity building cooperation programs with Vietnam. But with regard to Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, Japan's position vis-a-vis BRI is that Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific is not incompatible with Belt and Road Initiative. That's the official position. Yeah, and as a result, I think there could be certain cases, theoretically speaking, where a single country can, you know, receive funding or investment from both China and Japan. And there were some attempts to find a common project in third countries. If I recall correctly, they may have tried something in Malaysia, if I recall correctly. But, you know, one of the concerns that we have is that certain BRI projects do not, you know, fulfill standards that Japan considers important, like environment, human rights, and other, and transparency and so forth. So in certain cases, it's not really possible to for Japan and China to cooperate in a single common project. And that might sort of work to the detriment of certain countries like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar that are getting a lot of, particularly Cambodia and Laos, I imagine, a lot from China. So, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Japan's going to, you know, cut off or terminate different kinds of programs. So I'm sorry, I don't have figures and numbers to indicate the trend of Japanese investment and development assistance, but Japan is now very much committed to engaging regional countries on all directions. And particularly, I think Japan's interested in reaching out and engaging countries that are that receive a lot of investment from China, so that our position is fully understood in country. You saw the Fukushima treated water issue, and in those instances, I think the Japanese government did an all-directional diplomacy to convey our understanding. And so from that perspective, I think Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar are still very, very important countries. Myanmar is actually a country that Japan has special attachment to, because it was a country that United States didn't have diplomatic ties, but Japan did. And so we've been providing a lot of yen loans, ODA loans in the past. And I think there is continuing effort to maintain ties. So yeah, that's my understanding right now. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sean King at Park Strategies Consulting Firm. Thank you for your presentation. Two quick questions, if I may. I understand Tokyo's urge for dialogue with Beijing, but how can Japan credibly label the PRC not a threat when you consider all the incursions into the Senkaku Islands? And secondly, as traumatic as it was and could be again, was the Trump era, golden golf gloves aside, in some ways positive for Japan because it caused Tokyo to take a leadership role that it would not have otherwise, specifically CPTPP? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. On the first question, when I said not a threat, if you identify country as a threat, it means you're after the regime and wants to destroy the regime. So it's a definitional issue. They don't label China as a threat because we're not after regime change. So obviously it's a security challenger because it's making these intrusions into Senkaku waters, territorial waters, and adjacent waters. And I'm not saying that Japan's going to, suddenly create a friendly relationship with China. No, that's not the case. we have strong security concerns vis-a-vis China because of its coercive actions, not only in East China Sea, but also South China Sea and Taiwan. So what I meant by, China being not a threat is we don't pursue a policy of regime change and containment vis-a-vis China. Second point on Mr. Trump's, the consequences of Mr. Trump's policy, providing Japan with leadership in the CPTPP. Did you say? Yes.
Because we stepped back,
Uh-huh.
we created a vacuum and filled the U.S. role in Asia. So I think
Uh-huh.
as painful as it was,
Uh-huh.
and it was not in the U.S. interest, we
Mm.
suffered. I think Japan took a leadership role that it wouldn't have otherwise.
Mm.
I think Japan has asserted itself more in the absence of U.S. leadership.
Yes, I guess you could say that, but it would be even more better if US were inside CPTPP. Yes. So yes. So relatively speaking, yes, I think you could say that Japan did. Japan's political presence and leadership in the trade area became more conspicuous as a result of US withdrawal. Yes, but substantively speaking or economically speaking, I think it would have been better if US did come alongside with us in pursuing CPTPP expansion. Well, we never have had to call it CP, right? Put CP in the front if US remain. But anyway, so yeah, that's my response. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the very comprehensive presentation. Nobu Shizuka, Center for Japanese Legal Studies. My question is macro in nature, and it relates to one of the core objectives of Japan to maintain the status quo, a term that one could argue changes over time. The status quo before the competition and interdependency with China is a lot different than the status quo today. If Japan were able to achieve every objective that you outlined, okay, what would that status quo actually look like? In other words, what level of competition and what level of interdependence is Japan willing to accept as the new status quo, if it's different from today's?
Thank you. What level of competition and also competition and interdependence? Yes. So you're talking about the ideal sort of an end state? Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, achieves everything. Okay. I think the ideal outcome would be for Japan to establish a strong trade and investment ties with the rest of the Southeast Asian regions. Secondly, it would be even more better vis-a-vis China if the Chinese leadership comes to two very different realizations. One is that rather than trying to make world depend on China, China is better off depending on the world. And I think that's very important from Japan's perspective, because many of the frictions that we are experiencing right now is based on this kind of a shift where China is pursuing a sort of a great power status and trying to reverse its relations and try to become more sort of autarkic in a way and try to make the other countries depend on China and use economic leverage in order to apply pressure and accept CCP. We would ideally want to see that kind of policy reversed. And so that would be one major change that we would want to see happen. Number two, I wouldn't say China's regime change because that's too far-fetched. I don't think that's possible. But on the technology side, I think there would be much more, how should I say, much better if Japan and so-called like-minded states, including certain countries in Europe and also the United States, were to sort of establish a sort of an ecosystem where they can advance technology development in a very, very, how should I say, rapid way, innovative way, and create its own space so that we are able to generate new sources of economic growth among common countries with common values. And that would eventually sort of work on China's mind that there is a sort of the notion of US decline. I think a lot of China's actions are based on this assumption that West is on the decline, absolute decline. But I think it's very necessary to change that perception as well make China believe that that's not the case, and that United States and its allies and partners are able and capable, able and willing to sort of achieve high economic growth. And if that happens, I think China's behavior, I'm not quite sure, but there is a chance. I think we have a better opportunity and better chance of trying to moderate China's external behavior by making China open up, by making China avoid tension with important economic partners, including Japan and maybe South Korea as well, and Australia and others. And so, yeah, those would be some of the, I think, the kind of end state I think we would want to see happen. Yeah, from the outside, that's what we can probably do. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for the talk. My name is Anthony. I'm a student at CEPA. I was really captivated by your discussion of this change from the function defined division of security to the theory defined division. So my question is, as this division continues, do you see Japan taking on a theater role, or do you see it more as a future connector for different theater leading countries? I'm also thinking of Article 9 in the Constitution. So in the past, Japan's been able to help the US in, for example, the Iraq war with logistics. Do you see that trend continuing in the Pacific, or do you see it as evolving into something more active?
My personal view at this point is that I talked about Japan assuming a larger role in the offensive side, be the spear for its own sake. That is even very difficult, I think. That's an ideal way. That's the path that Japan is now progressing. But Japan's self-defense force has many issues, problems, particularly in the area of readiness. I didn't mention this in my talk, but if you look at the reality of the Japanese self-defense force, the operational rate is something like 50%. It should be 70 to 80%. The number of missile defense interceptors is only 60% of what is required. The number of parts and for weapon systems is in shortage, very big shortage. So last year, I think it was for only air self-defense force alone, there were 1,300 cases where they had to take one part from one weapon system and you put it to another weapon system, which is kind of horrific if you come to think about it. Maybe 80% of the Japanese self-defense force facilities are not hardened. So there's a long way to go to develop these new capabilities. And before going there, Japanese government is going to have to invest heavily on replenishment of these, shortages, and also address hardening issues of facilities. So in the near future, I don't see Japan going far beyond national defense. The best it can do is to be able to defend itself quite sufficiently on its own, which would enable the US to focus on Taiwan. But Japan going beyond Japanese national defense and going for the defense of Taiwan itself I don't think is viable at this point. And but Japanese maritime defense force has been conducting exercises, joint exercises with the regional countries. So in that front, I think Japan's been very active for security cooperation. But when it comes to defense, actual national defense and warfighting and so forth, I don't think it'll go beyond the national defense perimeters. And so I think Iraq was it was solely devoted for humanitarian and reconstruction issues. But if it's about combat missions, I think it's something very, very different. And right now there are certain limits, as you said, constitutional limits, but more realistically, capacity and capability. There are certain limitations about what we can do. Yeah. So that would be my answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. I have about 100 questions, but I'll stick to two if I can. One is you've already spoken a bit about what we might expect if there's a second Trump administration. But what do you expect to see in terms of the Japanese government hedging if you do have an erratic and isolationist U.S. administration, whether it's Trump or somebody like him coming in? And second is after the October 7th massacre in Israel, you saw a really extraordinary G7 statement, leaders, head of state statement, put out very forward leaning, but the only one missing was the G7 chair, Japan. Yeah, it's a G6. So I'd just love to hear a little of your thoughts on the dynamics of that. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Jim. It's good to see you. Great to see you. With regard to your first question, how could Japan potentially hedge against a second Trump administration or any isolationist U.S. administration? There is increasing worry, when I go into these study groups with other experts, people are beginning to sort of talk about what are the implications and what kind of changes would Japan be forced to make if there is a isolationist administration in Washington. I don't think we should overreact. If I were to be very sort of cool-headed as much as possible in the defense area, for example, if we do have a sort of an America First type of approach towards defense of Japan, Japan's going to have to step up its effort to build up its own defense. And I think it makes sense, quite frankly. I think GDP 2% is, personally, I don't think it's enough. Japan should have been doing much more from even before. And, not allowing isolationist forces to criticize US allies as free riders is one goal. And I think it makes perfect sense for US taxpayers to ask, why are these countries not paying for their own defense? I mean, I think that's a legitimate question, quite frankly. And Japan needs to work more so that Japan can rebut against that kind of criticism against Japan. And I certainly think that's a case for Japan. 2% is NATO standard, and NATO has 32 countries. And look at Western Pacific, we only have a handful of US allies, and we are facing China. I don't think 2% is going to be enough. And so even from that perspective, I think we have to do more. So with or without an isolationist administration, I think we have to work more on defense. Secondly, on diplomacy, in that respect, I do worry about, we were joking the other day that if Mr. Trump comes back in, he might have a US, China, Russia summit among Trump, Xi, Putin summit. But that's a joke. But on the diplomatic side, I think there would be a sort of a reinvigorated effort on the part of Japan to stabilize relationship with China and also maybe North Korea. Some of President Trump's interlocutors, and so that we don't get into a sort of a Nixon shock type of situation. That's something that Japan will become very cautious about. And the real challenge is in the economic area, I think, the trade friction area. We don't know how much, whether he's going to impose these tariffs on Japan. Technology regulation, quite frankly, I think it has its own dynamic, if I'm correctly. I think there are certain domestic considerations attached to it, not only like Chinese national security issues. So technology regulation, I think, will continue to become tighter, and Japan's going to have to, coordinate and collaborate and adapt to the changing situation. So the tariff trade dynamic is the economic negotiation is going to be the central piece. And it's going to depend on many factors, but I'm not quite sure whether the Japanese Prime Minister will be able to, deal with Mr. Trump in an effective way to sort of try to dampen the issue and so forth. But so if you look at it that way, you can sort of narrow down the points of concern and try to think that one is about trade negotiation, and the other was maybe on the defense side, host nation support. That came up at the very end of the first Trump administration. Pentagon was asking for a sort of a host nation support budget at the conventional level, and when it went to the White House, it kind of went 5 times as much, and then the administration, made its finished, so we didn't have to deal with that. But if something similar happens, I would say that if that issue is going to cause a major political rift or upset Mr. Trump and turn it into a drama, then there are ways to sort of for the authorities to come up with wise ways to use those larger sum of host nation support. For example, Japan can pay and then the US side can use it for alliance resilience purposes. That's the term that they renamed. The official name is Host Nation Support Budget, but I think the Susho is what the casual name of the Host Nation Support Budget has been changed to Alliance Resilience Fund or something, 同盟強靭化基金 or something like that. Yeah, and I think that sort of how should I say a creative way for Japan to ostensibly pay to the United States, but that funding could be refunded for the purposes of common defense. And I think that kind of I don't think Mr. Trump would see the consequence. What matters to him is whether Japan did pay the first amount of large sum of money. So this is just an idea, but so there are things that we have to ideas about how to manage this kind of political economy. If the costs are too high, then we should come up with ideas to mitigate those costs and risks of a rift between Japan and China. On the Israel issue, first to describe Japanese government's position. Initially, I think the Japanese government issued a statement that requested both sides to exercise restraint. But then Japanese foreign vice minister contacted, or actually he requested the Israeli ambassador to come to the foreign ministry. And Mr. Okano, who's the vice minister, he conveyed to the Israeli ambassador that Israel has a right to defend itself, and clearly called Hamas a terrorist organization. So I think that right now Japan's position is quite clear. They don't accept Hamas's atrocities in Israel, and that Japan is also taking that kind of position very clearly. The most recent Japanese government official action with regard to this issue was at the UN General Assembly resolution. And I think Japan abstained from the resolution, together with UK and other countries. And I think the wish right now is, I think, because of this horrific situation, Israel has the right to go after a terrorist organization, right? But at the same time, they want to see a sort of a humanitarian measures taken for the people in Palestine. And I think the Biden administration is also taking that kind of position. So we don't want to see the conflict expand at the same time. And so I think Japan's also very fearful of Hezbollah's reaction and also potentially Iranian reaction. But what is probably very important is that there are it's not like Israel versus Palestine or certain countries against Israel or anything, but I think it's about there was this strong movement towards stabilization and normalization in the region, right? Starting with the Abraham Accords, and there are forces that are trying to disrupt that movement, and that should be the sort of the crosscut. I think the people in Palestine should be separated from Hamas, and they deserve to be seen as through a different lens, because I don't think they wanted to see this happen, right? So Japan's position pretty much, I think, will be about forces for peace and forces for disruption, and we despise and criticize and we oppose all forces that are trying to disrupt movements towards stabilization and peace in the region. So, and I think that's the general. I don't think the government has made explicit, but my sense is the Japanese people's general sense would be something along that line. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
I will just follow up and then give a comment on the questions of the host nation support, because I think that's another question of division labor, and then the way that two allies change division, divide the labor is changing, right? Like initially, since 1978 or 1979, Japanese government agreed to pay because Japanese economy was rising, and the expenses that Japanese government usually pay is pay for the income for the Japanese workers on the bases, and also sort of gas and light, like those living expenses for the U.S. military personnel. What you're mentioning about alliance resilience funds are interesting. I mean, in addition to the name change, I think if Japanese and U.S. governments can negotiate on the money goes to U.S. military capability or defense investment, but that which serves alliance purpose, that is more substantive than just kind of paying for the income of the Japanese worker or living expenses. So that's an interesting conversation. Then maybe the just negotiating on host nation support will become more of a defense cooperation issues rather than who's being fair to who's actually taking the burden. So it's not burden sharing, but it's more of defense initiatives. Yeah.
I think investing in hardening of bases would be a good way to sort of reinvest after we pay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I'm Yuki Nagata from the I'm the first year master student here at the Weatherhead, and I have two questions. One question about Japanese grant strategy, and the second question is about like how to elicit like public support for Japan's involvement in Taiwan contingency. So my first question, the grant strategy. So like now, from my understanding, Japanese foreign policy has been like centering around the so-called like like strategic ambiguity rather than the like reassurance oriented like diplomacy based on Article 9 or something, for example. But like the question here is like how can you gauge the validity of the policy? Like how can you make sure this strategic ambiguity is working positively to deter China from attacking Taiwan? And my second question is about the public support side, and how can you think, like how do you think it can increase once people in Japan recognize the fact that once Taiwan contingency happens, Japan's mainland will be definitely attacked, involved because of the existence of US bases. Like even though US mainland, for example, will remain unscathed because it's so far, and another comment, like so like there was one politician like who's telling Taiwan's are like showing the readiness to join this war can be interpreted as the deterrence or something. But like I think so from understanding it's not politicians who are going to the war, it's SDF soldiers, and if it's a citizen who maybe get involved in the war and who may be killed and injured, whatever. So given what I said, how do you think what do you think is the best strategy for soliciting more public support for the Taiwan contingency?
I would just also add about what Professor Mori said in the last slide about whether US and Japan are ready for Taiwan contingency. One of the missing part is Japanese public support. I mean, Japanese public support seems to defense more investment in defense capabilities and increasing budget, and as long as they are not taxed for it. But when it comes to actually thinking about war dead, right, and then having casualties on the ground and civilian casualties, which will probably involve if the U.S. bases in Japan attacked, that question still remains unanswered. And then I think Yuki points out that where the people who bear the cost might not be the people who are advocating for the policies of strong deterrent signals against China. So if you could touch on that public perception, that'd be great.
Okay. Thank you very much for the excellent questions. On the first question about strategic ambiguity, when we suppose we were to sort of shift to a strategic clarity position, the worry is that how China would interpret that. And it would be seen, as you may know, there's this dual deterrence strategy on the part of the United States. And I think the general thinking is shared also in Japan. If you say that the United States and Japan is going to come to the aid of Taiwan in the event of Chinese invasion, Chinese side will interpret that as a signal that US and Japan are encouraging Taiwan independence in a way. In order to sort of deter both China and Taiwan, the strategic ambiguity was there. So it's not that the strategy is ambiguous. There is a strategy, right? The strategy is to deter both sides. But if you say that we are going to lean on one side, China, regardless of our intention, regardless of our true intention, we don't want to, encourage Taiwan independence, right? We want to actually maintain status quo. But China will interpret it as a way for us to shift towards a sort of a pro-independence movement. And it could trigger something very dangerous. And if we are not prepared for any Chinese invasion, we don't want to trigger any sort of crisis in the short term. So that's why I think for the moment, at least, if we believe we are not prepared or fully ready for a Chinese invasion, I don't think it's necessarily wise for us to send a signal to China. It may sound ironic, right? Because we are saying that we're going to send Taiwan, but China might react to that by taking a very drastic step. And if that happens, if we're ready, it's okay. But if we're not, then it's not going to be wise, right? So that's the idea, I think, behind the understanding behind the existing position about maintaining strategic ambiguity, right? On the second part about how to maintain Japanese public support for Taiwan contingency, I'm sort of actually doing this argument inside Japan right now. There's been a lot of focus on what would be the fallout from a armed conflict over Taiwan. You know, what kind of damage Japan will sustain, how many people will die. And, you know, former SDF officials have very graphic descriptions of, you know, what the casualties could be. Any public is not prepared for a great power war, right? So once they see this kind of graphic description of casualties, I worry that there could be a very sort of a war-avoiding sentiment. You know, we originally have this kind of a pacifist sentiment at the very end, and any public doesn't want to die in a war, right? I mean, this is applicable to any country. So if that is the case, deterrence is capability and intention. And if intention is weak, then the other side will see more of a sort of an opportunity to invade. So how do you strengthen public resolve? My argument right now is that don't think in terms of war damage or casualties, but we have to think in terms of what's going to happen to Japan if Taiwan falls under Chinese control. If you come to think about that, you know, one can imagine, you know, People's Liberation Army moving into Taiwan and having free access to the Western Pacific, right? If that happens, U.S. force posture will have to dramatically change. U.S.'s ability to defend Japan is going to dramatically be reduced. And Japan is going to turn into a sort of a strategic enclave. And at the same time, China is going to probably apply massive economic and other pressure on Japan to accept Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, because we will be opposing unilateral change in the status quo by force, right? So, and if that happens, can Japan resist that kind of pressure in the midst of a very, very isolated strategic environment? And if Japan is forced to bend its policy, that's losing independence, right? And freedom. And so that's the kind of that's Chinese regional hegemony, I think. And so if we want to avoid, if we start thinking in those terms, we come to realize that the defense of Taiwan is not only about the defense of Taiwan, but it's also about the defense of Japan's future, right? Because if that's going to come, people will come to realize that it's not about the Taiwanese people's well-being. It's about Japan's future. And then you can start thinking about, well, Japan has to pay taxes. We have to invest in deterrence. We should assume risk in the face of a crisis. We should not back down in the event of a crisis. That kind of public resolve becomes possible to form. So, but, you know, unless you have that kind of mindset, we will be very easily fall prey to information operations. For example, China can say, why does the Japanese people have to die for Taiwan? If you stay out of this conflict, this is going to end quickly, and everything's going to be solved. And if that kind of information operation, you know, is, you know, conducted against Japanese public opinion, you know, they could say, yeah, why don't we stay out? Why should we die for Taiwan? And it kind of reinforces this notion that Taiwanese security is divisible from Japanese security, but which is not the case, because once China, as I mentioned, you know, if China controls Taiwan, it's going to have huge ramifications for Japanese independence and freedom. So, you know, changing this kind of, you know, framework of understanding regarding Taiwan is what is necessary. And I think we haven't had that kind of debate in Japan. And I think it also applies for the United States as well. How does, you know, American citizens think about the meaning of defending Taiwan? You know, people talk about military implications, economic implications, technological implications, particularly, you know, semiconductors, and, you know, defending the meaning of defending democracies. And if you kind of put it in a sort of a line item style, it's very abstract. But I think the way to think about this is, what is going to happen to U.S. national security if Taiwan falls under Chinese control, and if PLA comes near Honolulu or maybe California, I don't know. That's going to have dramatically changed the strategic environment of the Pacific region in its entirety, perhaps. And if you start thinking about that, then I think U.S. access to Indo-Pacific is going to be undermined. I think the CCP has a very strong distrust towards the U.S. system as a whole. And so you could probably expect a severe security competition in the Pacific region. And you would probably have to invest more and more on defense, less and less on national welfare. And you don't want to see that happen, right? So those are some things that we have to think about when we think about the meaning of defending Taiwan, I think, for both Japan and the United States. Or otherwise, we won't be able to form a public resolve. And when it comes to the matter of war, it's not only about politics and military, but it's also about society, right? Society is thinking about whether it's able to resist aggression or forceful change of the status quo is what counts and matters in the long term, particularly if we were to have a protracted conflict, right? I don't think the US is interested in escalating to a nuclear war, so we're likely to have a conventional protracted conflict over the long term. And that's where the public resolve is going to be tested. If it's not strong, then it's likely that the weaker side with the weaker will probably give up and go for negotiations. So the key to sort of persevering and enduring a protracted conflict is strong public resolve, and that needs to be sort of generated through a sort of a reframing and a rediscovery of the meaning of Taiwan security to both Japanese and American security, I think. Yeah.
Your last question. Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. My name is Jacqueline. I'm an undergraduate at Columbia. I had two quick questions. One, you discussed economic over-reliance on the U.S. on the part of Japan and how the introduction of a second President Trump term impacts Japan's need to adapt. How does China take advantage of that protectionist gap that's created? And how does Japan consider the possible room for growth and engaging with China? And my second question, you had mentioned Japan engaging in AUKUS Pillar 2. And how does China respond to that? And how does it change the calculus of other countries in the Indo-Pacific and their relationship with Japan? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Your first question was, how could China potentially take advantage of economic rift between Japan and the United States, basically? I see. Well, China has been trying to, how should I say, slow down U.S. efforts to encircle China with a sort of a technological regulation, as you may have heard. If they see a rift between Japan and the United States, or also U.S. ally and the United States, I think they will see a better chance of trying to sort of divide U.S. and allies in its U.S. allies and sort of hinder U.S. effort to sort of cut technology transfer from U.S. allies to China. I'm not quite sure whether they will be able to actively capitalize on a trade friction issue or other issues, but they will see an opportunity that they will be able to sort of slow down the coalition building effort by the United States and find ways. I'm not quite sure what specific ways, particularly in the context of trade friction. I'm not quite sure. So I have to think about that. Yeah. But it's a good question. I think it's something that we have to think about when we face second Trump administration, perhaps. AUKUS Pillar 2. How could China react to that? Was your question, I believe. China hates coalition building. Yeah, so I'm quite certain that if we were to join Pillar 2 AUKUS, then it would see as a sort of a major balancing effort on the part of US, Australia, UK, and Japan. And so subjectively speaking, it would have a sort of a balancing effect and hopefully a deterring effect. But, I don't think it will qualitatively change China's, how should I say, competitive attitude towards Japan. but nevertheless, it would benefit greatly to our advantage. The reason why I say this is because when we talk about building up deterrent capability in the Western Pacific, I think the frontline states are US, Japan, Australia, plus Taiwan, obviously. And the key to generating a credible deterrent is interoperability. And when we're talking about building up future defense capability, the key is to standardize various kinds of technologies among the key countries. So Japan maintaining a high degree of interoperability with US and Australia, plus UK as the supplier, it makes very good sense for us. Japan developing these cutting edge technologies for military application in an isolated way is going to be, we talk about Galapagos situation, but that's going to work to the disadvantage to the Japan. So in that sense, I think using AUKUS as a way for us to enhance interoperability with the United States and Australia will allow us to build up a stronger deterrent, credible deterrent, and it will have the necessary deterrent effect and impact on China, I think. Some regional states might not like it. I think Indonesia reacted negatively to AUKUS Pillar 2 because it would probably instigate a arms race in the region. And we'll have to, engage in diplomatic dialogue that we are the ones reacting to China's arms buildup. Sometimes, there's this reverse narrative saying that somehow what we are doing is going to inflame Chinese anger and that we're doing something bad, but it's not it's the other way around, right? So, so that kind of dialogue is necessary, but we have to appreciate regional states' concern that they don't want to see us worsening security competition. And but so we have to come up with reassuring messages. What can we do to reassure regional states while deterring China is a very, very important question, I think. And I'm sorry that I don't have a clear-cut silver bullet solution for you, but it's a good question. I want to think about it from now on. Yeah. So thank you very much for the good questions. Yeah.
Well, the 90 minutes really passed quickly. Thank you all so much for asking very good questions. And please join me thanking Professor Mori for coming to Columbia and sharing his insights.